Hello, everyone.
Hello, sir.
Hi, folks. Is everybody drunk enough yet, or are you guys still taking it slow? Good. I like that. I like that.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shit, man.
Yes.
You have down.
Thank you.
Let's get one of those. I love that idea. All right, folks. So today we're going to talk about Wardriving, the public safety band. So has anybody heard of the public safety band before? The public safety? Yes. Good. How many people are ham operators? Ham? Yeah, good.
Sweet.
Do you guys know about 4.9 gigahertz? No. Some yes, some not. Okay, good. So some of this might be a little bit of, I love you so much. Great.
You're the man. Thank you, sir.
Cheers to PhreakNIC.
To PhreakNIC.
All right, so public safety spectrum's been around for a little bit, but we're going to cover all the new shit. By new, I mean in the last 10 years. So there's going to be some changes, but you might know some of it, and we dug a little bit into 4.9 gigahertz, and we'll show you what we found there. Real quick, my name is Brad Antonowitz. I work at Foundstone as part of their open security research project, and that allows me to play around with a bunch of different stuff, kind of whatever I feel like. And Rob does a whole bunch of wireless stuff, and he basically was like, hey, man, I heard there's this 4.9 gigahertz shit. Tell us about it. And so he told me about it, and now we're here. That's it. That's the whole story.
More or less.
Yeah. And that's Rob.
Hi. I'm Rob. I'm the wireless service line lead at Foundstone. I teach the wireless hacking class at Foundstone as well. And in my spare time and my work time, I like to hack stuff.
So I think probably the first thing that we should say before we really talk too much about this is we were starting to get really worried about kind of the legal things with this, specifically like 4.9 gigahertz. You need FCC license to transmit in some of the areas, and I don't really know about receive or any of that stuff. And I was trying to look it up in the Code of Federal Regulations and the Communications Act of 1934 and all this stuff, and it all just was kind of complicated to me. So before you guys do anything, just proceed with caution. I really don't know the legalities of any of this stuff. Be careful.
So before we give this talk at DEF CON, the EFF was nice enough to kind of counsel us on it, and their take on it was pretty much as long as you're passively monitoring the networks, that is not interacting with them in any way of sending traffic or purposely trying to access them, you're in pretty good shape. And as long as you're approaching it from the standpoint of not being malicious. So
yeah, just don't be a dick.
Be careful.
Basically. All right, so today we'll talk about public safety, a couple of spectrum allocations, and then we'll take a focus on 4.9 gigahertz and talk about some of the things that we saw there and how you can look around too if you have an FCC license, I guess. So the public safety spectrum is actually has been around for quite a while now. It's basically a couple of different allocations that the FCC has made for the sole purpose of to protect the safety of life, health, or property. So that's kind of a very broad statement, but basically it's a reserved area that government can use that doesn't have to worry about getting interference from any other different areas. It comprises of actually a couple of different areas of the spectrum, and the ones that we'll briefly talk on are out here. So this is the radio spectrum. The relatively new shit is what we'll be looking at, and it has color that's not gray. And so we'll be talking about the 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, focusing on 4.9 gigahertz, and then we'll also briefly look at 5.9 gigahertz. The ponies are everywhere, man. Ponies are everywhere.
The ponies are coming. Actually,
yeah, we are.
We'll
we have a pony. You'll like it.
Pony, not the kind.
So first up is 700 megahertz. So actually, if you guys remember, there's this whole digital TV cutover, and that big digital TV cutover optimized the spectrum a little bit and freed up the upper D block of the spectrum in 700 megahertz. So the FCC said, all right, well, we'll use that. We'll reallocate it to public safety, and we'll actually subdivide it a little bit into broadband and narrowband areas, and so kind of people can use it. The big thing about it is it's going to be nationwide, so a lot of state and local municipalities are really interested in it, and it has a lot of big potential. Ponies.
There's the pony.
So So the broadband network is what everyone's really, really excited about. So this is a broadband LTE network. So the idea behind it is it's going to be, it's actually outsourced to a bunch of, a big telecom provider and stuff.
So there's the NPSTSC, the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, and they're overseeing it. It's going to be done under this blanket or organization known as FirstNet. Basically, the long and short of it is they're in the planning stages of rolling this thing out now, and at the rate they're going, it should probably be done sometime in 2075.
But there's actually some small spots that are using little test areas.
There's been they've gotten variances, or they've gotten what's the word I'm looking for? Permission to go ahead with their own test implementations, and there's a few of those going forward. They just had the first meeting of FirstNet, so basically it's in the planning stages. It's very early on, but when it does go forward, it's going to be LTE, and it's going to be a nationwide public safety broadband network. And they're looking at that being the backbone of the public safety.
Yeah, I mean, remember with this public safety stuff, a lot of it came out of 9/11 and Katrina and all this stuff. There was all these kind of reviews that happened, looking at how we responded to those major incidents, and it turned out that we didn't know how to communicate. A lot of people were using different radios, a lot of people were using different networks and stuff, and so a lot of the public safety stuff was to kind of unify everybody so that if there is a big emergency, we can all communicate easily together, especially, all the government.
One more thing on that, too. In regards to the D-Block auction, which was at 10 megahertz of space, adjacent to the existing broadband allocation, part of that was if no providers actually bought that. None of the telecom providers bought that at auction. The idea was going to be if you bought it, there was a condition that you would have to put money into helping develop this nationwide broadband network. The theory is that nobody bought it based on that, and so that's been reconfigured in the way they're going to be doing it.
Yeah, and then the narrowband portion of that 700 megahertz spectrum is all for P25. So some of you ham radio operators may have heard of P25. It's just basically kind of a trumped radio system that you can kind of communicate back and forth with. There's been some vulnerabilities found in it, and it's being used by, I think, the FBI and Secret Service. I know I'm from New York, and in New York there's some very small usages of it. I don't know, how it is used throughout other areas, but in New York there's very, very minimal. So the other public safety allocation is the 800 megahertz spectrum, and this kind of spectrum was actually there's a bit of tension around this whole thing. Basically, it was initially subdivided in a way where there was some that was kind of for public safety, some was for kind of SMR radio usage, and then some of the stuff was kind of general usage. And the way FCC was allocating licenses was kind of all over the spectrum. And so Nextel started to build out their network, and what happened was they would just go and buy up other people's license. And so they started to take over a lot of this spectrum. And that was causing interference onto some of the areas that were a little bit more dedicated to, say, public safety. So the FCC got pissed about that, and they actually kicked out Nextel out of the lower range of the block and told them to move all the way to the kind of the other side. They put in a guard band and kind of reconfigured it.
So the reason that was causing a lot of problems was that there was what's called a high side architecture and a low side architecture. And with the public safety implementation we're using, it's called a high side architecture. It's very, a few or lesser amount of transmitters on very high locations like tops of tall buildings, hilltops, stuff like that, very tall towers. What Nextel was using for the ESMR is called a low side architecture, which is many more sites but on a much lower vertical plane. So like, 3-story buildings, lower poles, things like that. And that just added to the problem. So interestingly enough, I see now that when the government basically told Nextel that because of this, you're going to have to foot the bill for all this. And that was before Sprint bought Nextel, and I don't know why Sprint would have bought Nextel with that sort of hammer hanging over their head. But at any rate, Nextel is now apparently going to be no more, and as I just read recently, Sprint is now going to be taking the spectrum that they had from Nextel and using it for LTE now. So another interesting turn of events.
Yeah, and this 800 megahertz stuff is also going to be more P25 voice. So, there's a couple of allocations you'll see here that are all kind of for voice, specifically P25. And the reason why is P25 has some encryption capabilities to kind of secure the radio communications between field operatives, and they don't have to worry about maybe somebody being evil and trying to listen while they're committing a crime or anything like that. And so what we really care about is 4.9 gigahertz. We'll talk about the 5.9 briefly after this, but the most of this talk is going to be about 4.9 gigahertz. Basically, there was this need that municipalities felt that they had where they needed high-speed data transfer. And so 4.9 gigahertz was allocated for that. A lot of the stuff operates similar to the way 802.11 operates, and kind of allows these quick data transfers. One of the specific uses that people were kind of thinking about using 4.9 gigahertz for was like, on-the-scene networks. So, an ambulance, a fire truck, and a police, all come together on a scene, and they need to communicate quickly and transfer data. They can set up a mobile or temporary network and establish that communication back and forth. But when they allocated 4.9, nobody really said what exactly it was going to be for. So everybody, these municipalities, kind of all jumped aboard. They were like, yeah, we need this. I'm not really sure what exactly it does, but we need it. They all got a bunch of licenses for it. And then they were like, all right, well, what do we use it for? And so what you find is that it's actually being used as a very kind of general area for these kind of point-to-point connections some places. The Republican National Convention and the DNC and G20 Summit, they all used it just for their Wi-Fi. There's SCADA networks on there. There's all types of crazy stuff.
Some of the, when they originally, implemented this, the original thought was it was going to be used for sort of like ad hoc networks at the site of a incident response, things like accidents or more prolonged events such as protests or hostage situations, what have you. What it ended up being is that you see it most primarily used now for like backhaul point-to-point links and surveillance cameras. Authorities love surveillance cameras, and there's plenty of them. So you see it used for that quite a bit. It has been used in such instance, though, like Brad was saying, the RNC and DNC, and I believe 2008 it was used. It was used at the G20 in Pittsburgh, and so on and so forth. But primarily, you generally see it used for things like city, permanently mounted surveillance cameras.
Yeah, but it's just kind of general use. It's kind of strange on where they're using it all. So the way that the FCC started to regulate this a little bit was they said, all right, there's going to be categories, low power and high power. And if you're transmitting, above 20 dB, then you're considered a high power device, and you have to follow some of these strict guidelines. But if you transmit lower than that, then you can kind of do whatever you want for the most part, as far as how your channel layout's going to be, and things like that. So one of the important things they have to remember when looking at 4.9 gigahertz networks is it's kind of a problem to figure out what the channels that they're using and how big the channels are, because they can be varying widths. With 802.11, we usually deal with 20 megahertz wide channels, but they can change it to anywhere between 1 megahertz to 10 megahertz to 40 megahertz. It just depends on how they want to do it. So for the high-powered devices, what they did was they said, okay, we're going to give you 10 1 megahertz wide channels split by 8 5 megahertz wide channels. And you can bond these any way that you want and make your channel configuration kind of any way you want that will suit your purpose. And that made manufacturers like Motorola, who wanted to do their own kind of channel, that made them happy and all that kind of good stuff.
So the general bonding is usually 5, 10, 15, or 20 megahertz wide channels. Generally you see 5, 10, 20 most commonly, with 10 being probably the most common out of those. The interesting thing about actually we're probably going to talk about this in the next slide, right? The masks.
Sure.
All right.
Jump right into it.
So there was two. It was kind of a conflict here between the vendors and the public safety technology advocates. The public safety personnel wanted to be able to use commercial off-the-shelf equipment. Specifically like 802.11j standard, which is the 4.9 gigahertz in Japan, utilizes 4.9 gigahertz spectrum with in the what would be kind of the Uni 2 band. And with 20 megahertz wide channels. So it wouldn't be too far of a stretch from that for manufacturers to make equipment for this that wouldn't be too difficult to utilize and would keep costs down, which was their concern. The manufacturers, particularly Motorola, were looking to establish a niche market wherein they would be able to provide this niche equipment, right, at exceptional prices, which some of it is. The compromise was that they developed two masks. And the two emissions masks, rather, one for low power devices below 20 dBi, and one and a high power mask for devices putting out more than 20 dBm.
Yeah, so you can see, like right in the graphic here, the outer line there is your standard 802.11 emission mask. And so that works fine for all low-power devices. So if you have a standard 802.11 adapter that can somehow drop down to 4.9 gigahertz, you're cool. You can actually communicate as long as you can deal with the different channel sizes and stuff. You can communicate without a problem. But for higher-power devices, they elegantly cut off the emission mask. They made it just strict enough that it wouldn't work with standard 802.11 devices, and you would have to get new hardware and stuff. And so it's kind of interesting that there was a lot of kind of people were saying I guess Motorola was lobbying a lot about this, particularly so they can kind of have this market to sell electronics.
So, sort of in addition to this, besides the 802.11 standard, you also have manufacturers that utilize other proprietary protocols within the space. So Motorola, for instance, uses MEA, which is Mobility Enhanced Access, their proprietary protocol. In New Jersey, some of the 4.9 gigahertz implementations on the Parkway utilize WiMAX. So it's all not 802.11 compliant or even close in some cases, unfortunately.
All right, and then the last public safety allotment that we'll look at before we start digging into kind of Wardriving the space is the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum. And this stuff is on my to-do list forever. It's really, really cool, interesting technology that they're putting in this area. So 5.9 gigahertz deals with intelligent transportation systems. So these are basically cars can kind of talk in between cars. They can do something called platooning and gather a bunch of cars together to operate at higher speeds. There's things where trucks have to go through way stations. So rather than to go through them, they can kind of wirelessly transmit their data. You can sense traffic blockage or problems up ahead. It's really, really interesting stuff. And we actually gave this talk at DEF CON, and somebody from the Department of Transportation in New York came up to us afterwards and said that they were, really testing all of this stuff out throughout New York. So basically, that said to me like, "Hey, come check this stuff out."
So there are some test implementations of it. It is fairly new in terms of implementation. If you look at the licenses, the FCC site, there's only about 130 something licenses in the entire U.S. However, there's a test implementation on the New York State Thruway upstate, and there is one on the LIE, Long Island Expressway, as well. And what they're testing basically there is through voluntary usage. They put a transmitter, an onboard, what's known as an OBU, an onboard unit in these trucks, and then they have a roadside unit, an RSU. And the trucks will transmit information such as a bunch of information about the service record of the truck, the driver's driving record, the information about the company, and in some cases they'll do what's called weigh in motion, where they'll actually be able to weigh the truck in motion. So that's some of the things they're doing now. In the LIE and other places, they're actually using it for electronic tolling. But the really interesting uses of this are in the future. So further on, when this becomes more ubiquitous in cars, what it'll be able to do is it'll be able to, by audibly or visually, by flashing lights and such, warn you if you are too close to something like a guardrail or another car is in your blind spot, or an ambulance is trying to come through, or other first responder vehicle, it will alert you. Further down the road, when driverless cars become somewhat ubiquitous, the idea with the platooning that Brad mentioned is that, so you would feel uncomfortable, I'm sure, driving 3 inches off the bumper of the car in front of you. Unless you're from New Jersey, then it's normal. That be as it may, But a computer, hopefully, if you trust it, would not be. And the idea between that is twofold. So if you're able to have a bunch of cars driving in one big cluster, a platoon, if you will, in formation, they're able to alleviate traffic because you don't have cars driving at different speeds, and also because of the aerodynamics of the air being broken by the cars in the front, flowing over the top of the entire column, if you will, and down the back. So things like this are looked at for the future. I believe in the Google driverless car implements some measures of DSRC. So things to come.
It's pretty I mean, to me, it's super interesting stuff, especially since you're dealing with vehicles in motion and there's a serious risk of loss of life there if there's some bad vulnerabilities there. So it's very interesting to me. The first step in looking up kind of any network and to see what's available is to kind of do a little bit of reconnaissance. So we'll talk about a couple of resources online that you can kind of find areas where you can identify, is there 4.9 gigahertz or is any of these public safety spectrums in use in your area. So any ham radio person would know radio reference. Basically, question? Oh, yeah. Yeah, everybody knows about radio reference. It's a great resource online. If you want to see what's being used, just kind of look for your local area. You can see whether or not anything's existing kind of in the 800 megahertz or the 700 megahertz spectrum, and it'll give you some information about that. Probably something that a lot of people don't know about is CAPRAD. And CAPRAD, when they were initially trying to figure out who's going to use what spectrum, what areas of public safety, what they did was they instructed a lot of people to go to this online resource called CAPRAD. And ideally what people would do is they'd say, okay, I'm using 700 megahertz in my town. A municipality would go there, a regional planning committee would go there, and say, I'm using 700 megahertz in my town, this is where I'm using it for, this is what I'm using it for. And then everybody else can kind of look and see how how everybody else is using it, other municipalities, and then they can plan things around that. But it wasn't really, it's used a little bit for 700 and 800 megahertz, not really too much for 4.9 and 5. And it requires actual registration, but it's kind of easy to get access to it if you just ask the guy, like, hey, give me an account, and he'll just create you one, so it's okay.
So the idea, basically, whatever you can get through guest access is pretty much what you'd get with an account anyway, or a regular level account. The idea was initially that, or was supposed to be in theory, that these municipalities will be able to plan through their regional planning committees, not to step on each other using these frequencies, so that you'd know where it'll tell you where all the different transmitters are, what radius they're registered for and such. It is pretty useful for 700 and 800 megahertz. You'll find a number of sites there. It's really not too much what you couldn't get through the FCC site, but some of the nice things in there is you can download a lot of your local 700 and 800 megahertz frequencies and channels in spreadsheet format. So it's pretty quick and dirty for those. But as Brad said, for 4.9 and 5.9, it's really just a pass through to the FCC site.
Yeah, and so probably the biggest help in finding these kind of different networks is just your standard FCC license search. So you can define a specific channel, a frequency range that you want to use. So here we're providing 4.940 to 4.990, and that will give us kind of all of the things that are existing in that spectrum that we're looking for. It returns some really good information from you. Sometimes the people who are filling out the forms
a little more completely than they needed to.
Yeah, they tend to be kind of a little bit more verbose than they probably have to be with that. But it also tell you, if you look down on the bottom there, if it's a mobile or a fixed a fixed usage. So this way, all right, well, if they plan on using it potentially for police in a police car and they go to a spot, then you probably won't be able to pick it up through standard Wardriving. But if it's a fixed area, kind of where to go. And then,
if you want to go to the next slide, I just want to cover a couple of things.
And then after that, it'll actually tell you the different frequency ranges that are allocated. And this is hugely helpful for you to figure out what channel usages they're using, right? So you can get an idea if they have one allocation for 4.950, and then the next allocation is for 4.960, you can take a pretty good guess that they're using 10 megahertz wide channels and where those channels start and end.
Probably. The biggest thing is definitely you want to the channel centers so that you can lock on to them. Generally, like Brad said, you can kind of figure that's probably 10 megahertz wide channels. Sometimes there's a lot of different recommendations in terms of channel the channel overlap. So it may not always be the case, and different manufacturers do things differently also. But as we'll see in a minute, sometimes there's ways to be able to tell what sort of equipment they're using as well. A couple things about this as well. So there's many records in there. You can search for the 4940 to 4990 frequency range, and you can search for your particular area. It'll show you all the sites for any particular town or city in there. What I found generally is the more information they have in their records there. Now, just because they have a license doesn't mean they definitely have an implementation.
Yeah, it almost seemed like a dick measuring contest between municipalities. Like, oh, did you get your license? Yeah, I did. Because we would have, everybody would have licenses, and we'd be driving around aimlessly looking for stuff and couldn't find anything. We'd search the internet. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. So I think people are just grabbing them to grab them.
So we chased some geese in Jersey, definitely with that. New Jersey. So a couple things. Yeah, quiet. So a couple different things there. Jersey had a lot of different licenses listed out, but most of them didn't seem to have implementations, or if they did, they were mostly point-to-point links, which you'd have to get in the middle of to try to get any semblance of a signal. Whereas New York City, much better because of the sites being much lower, being mounted on cameras and such, so better luck there. But a couple things. So it generally would seem like the more information is in their record, the more likelihood there will be a particular site there before you go driving 20, 30 miles to try to, ward drive it. But that's not always the case. For instance, sometimes you'll see in there, it'll say citywide license. Or as Brad was saying, they're mobile, right? It'll just have one license for the entire city, like Las Vegas had this, for instance. But Las Vegas, we found, had an implementation, and a pretty significant one. Whereas some of the towns in New Jersey that had all these different channels listed out appeared to have nothing. So it's not always, it's not an exact science always.
And sometimes it's kind of cool. They'll actually give you GPS coordinates, so you know exactly where to go if you want to find 4.9 gigahertz. But definitely one of the obvious huge resources to look up is 4.9 gigahertz plus any town name or police department name or anything like that. So here we looked up the NYPD with 4.9 gigahertz, and a lot of these when they want to request a license, basically, they'll actually request the FCC and write a pretty detailed letter to them. And so somehow these things manage their way on the internet, and so you can see what they're using them for and how they.
They're actually hosted on the DHS site, and moreover, beyond that, what happens generally is when any vendor does an implementation for a given municipality, they're more than happy to trumpet it all over the internet. Such and such did. They on the PR newswire and everything did implementation for such town using such equipment and sometimes such channels, and they get a little verbose about it. Yeah. So that's always helpful as well.
So I don't see the showdown slides there. So yeah, it looks like we lost some slides in the ether. Maybe you can just talk to it real quick.
Okay. So unfortunately, for some reason, I don't know why that deck came up like that. Okay, a couple other ways to find things. Number one, I was going to show you the actual letter there from the NYPD, but there it lists out in it the channels that they were using. Channels 6, 7. 9, 11, 9, 10, and 11, 10 through 13, I believe, which will tell you what, generally what center frequencies they are using. Furthermore, they didn't say what kind of equipment they were using, but they did say they give the FCC ID of the equipment. Now, you can look up the FCC identifier of any given piece of equipment if you have the ID on the FCC site. And what I found was that it was a Cisco 3200. So that's another way of being able to look up what kind of equipment they have, which will give you more information on their implementation. Okay, so a couple other ways of looking things up as well. Wiggle.net. You guys familiar with Wiggle? The wireless geographical locating engine. So that works, generally for 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. How is that going to help me with 4.9, you might ask? Well, there's a lot of equipment like Motorola's Moto Mesh Quattro that is dual band. So it does 2.4 and 4.9 gigahertz. And it has a unique SSID if it's using the, the default SSID, which is Moto Mesh. So in which case, you can look up the SSID of Moto Mesh find where that is located geographically, and there's a good chance that where there is a 2.4 gigahertz implementation, there will be a 4.9. Which was what I found in Las Vegas.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising how many of these. I mean, I guess it's a thing that as a security person I should know by now, but it doesn't cease to amaze me how many of these networks, even though they're on 4.9, they're clearly specialized equipment, they're still using default SSIDs, really weak configuration and security settings. And we'll talk a little bit about them in the next upcoming slides.
So one more way of finding a dance partner, as it was, is Shodan. Are you guys familiar with Shodan? So Shodan is what's the way to put it? It is a search engine for machines, for systems. Whereas Google helps you find web pages or web servers, Shodan will help you. You can search for any other number of services like SSH and Telnet and SNMP and pretty much any text string that's outputted by them. So if you go to Shodan, or you download there's a plugin in Metasploit, or there's a plugin for Firefox. You can put in, for instance, in my case, I just searched for 4.9 gigahertz, and what I found was a bunch of Trazio access points, Trazio TR49, if I remember correctly, which are APs that only do 4.9 gigahertz. They're made specifically for 4.9. And I found a number of those, some located in Haiti, some located in California, used by a couple different wireless ISPs. I was also able to find equipment from, I'm trying to think of the other manufacturer, Infinite, I believe it was, or I don't recall. I wish I had my slide. But the idea is, so you can either search for something like as simple as 4.9, or you can search for things like you could search for pieces of equipment like Motorola 4900 series or any other known 4.9 gigahertz controllers. And if Shodan has found them when scanning SNMP and it disclosed that information, you'll then be able to find them there. And generally, you'll also be able to tell, based on what Shodan gives you for information on the IP, where they're located geographically. So that's another good way of looking at it.
All right, so now that you've found certain areas of 4.9 implementations and stuff, we wanted to figure out, all right, how do we interact with these access points? How do we even start to mess around with them? So first thing when you mess around with any hardware is just search Google. And so we found a whole crap load of 4.9 gigahertz stuff on Google for varying prices. So we went out and tried to buy them. But it turns out the internet is full of a lot of people who don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because when you would go and contact these people and buy them, some of these guys, especially the guy on the bottom, he really sucked. I actually bought that. He shipped it from the UK, and it didn't have a 4.9 gigahertz radio in it. So a lot of these guys, they don't know where what they're getting or what they're selling. They just kind of look up some obscure model number and come to a conclusion that they're using it. So that kind of sucked a lot, but there was actually some good benefits of things. I came across this access point, and living in New York, it looked a little familiar to me. All throughout New York, there's a number of these security cameras kind of all over the place. It's a little dark here, but if you focus right on the top area, you'll see a kind of a familiar shape there, and that's actually the same access point that the NYPD uses as part of their video mesh network. So I picked up one of those. It was only $100. It's normally $1,000. I still don't know why it's so cheap. I guess somebody stole it. I have no idea. But I was pretty happy to pick that up and just kind of start playing around with it. Another interesting thing, when we were searching around and trying to find different hardware that exists, we came across this forum post on Ubiquiti's forum. So Ubiquiti is an access point, or just kind of a general wireless manufacturer. They make a lot of different hardware for different things. And there's just this kind of random post from 2010 where this guy's like, hey, I want to use this certain Ubiquiti access point in the 4.9 gigahertz spectrum. How do I do it? And so the response back is, just go to the wireless menu and change to compliance test mode. And so that appealed to me immediately. So we quickly went and bought one of those things. But it turned out was the one that we bought was so the model number is an NSM5. And the model number we bought was an NSM5-US. And it didn't have this compliance test mode. So I was getting old versions of the firmware, trying to figure out what was going on, trying to figure out. And actually, Rob figured out in May of 2011.
Let me, I'll take it.
Well, so in May of 2011, actually, Ubiquiti is kind of slapped on the wrist a little bit before that, because there was kind of certain cases where people were using Ubiquiti equipment in ranges that weren't permitted. And so Ubiquiti actually still supports this compliance test mode, but they just didn't include it in the US version. They had created another version called the World version. So we bought one of those.
So basically, Ubiquiti uses Theros chipsets in a lot of their equipment. And Theros, as we're going to see in a minute, you're able to unlock the chipset. It's not. It has a capability of being able to do from 4 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz, and it's only really prevented by doing that, preventing from doing that in the driver, as we'll see in a minute. And so wireless ISPs, and a lot of people seem to like to use their APs and utilize them either purposefully or not outside of what the accepted spectrum is. So they got a few wireless ISPs. I saw one when I was looking on the FCC site on the complaints section where they keep public records of complaints. One in Miami, one in Puerto Rico, one in Utah that I can think of. All near, what happened was they were having issues near airports with the terminal Doppler weather radar. There's something known as dynamic frequency selection on 5 gigahertz chipsets, which basically around 5.6 gigahertz or so, I believe it is, there is the terminal Doppler weather radar operates in that space. And in order to be able to use a chipset that operates near that, you have to have this dynamic frequency selection so that you don't interfere with that Doppler radar. Anyway, these guys, at least in a couple cases, disabled it. So far, and in doing so, interfered with the Doppler weather radar. FCC didn't like that very much and spanked them accordingly. So there was enough instances of this happening, and in the same time frame, that I gather that Ubiquiti caught some flack also from the FCC. And as a result of that, they released 2 versions now of these APs. They have a US version and a world version. And to buy the world version, you need to sign something stating that you have a license in the U.S.
Yeah. So when I was going to go try to buy this world version, because I had to go on a hunt for it now, because it wasn't immediately clear. I found this kind of shady online retailer that looked like they had a site from 1990 or so, and I saw that they had one, and I bought it. And the guy's like, "Hey man, listen, I forgot to ask you, but you have to sign this paper." Because recently Ubiquiti's been getting in a little bit of trouble. I need you to sign this. This basically says you have an FCC license. So I was like, no. And he was like, no, come on, man. I'm sorry. I know it has. I'm like, I need this immediately. No. And he sent it to me. So yeah, that worked out pretty well. As far as adapters go, so now we have some access points that we can play around with and see, see what these networks are like. Obviously, we were only using those access points in a Faraday cage in another country that supports 4.9 generally. Yeah, disclaimer. But, yes, Jersey is another country.
We bought a lot of tinfoil.
So you need some adapters to play with. So if you start Googling these adapters, 4.9 gigahertz, the first one you come up with is the Ubiquiti SR4C. This looks like a great adapter, but the problem is if you want to use it in Linux, the drivers don't actually support it. So it's kind of a pain in the butt, so you have to kind of look at other options. So the other thing that we had, if you do any wireless hacking, you've come across this card before. It's kind of like, to me, it's the best card ever because it supports a lot of different frequency spectrums and does a lot of, has like different antenna outputs, and it's a pretty powerful card. It's a Ubiquiti SRC 300. So it looks like a good card and everything, but by default, it doesn't clearly say what the range is. What the range that it supports is. So this guy, Kugatsuman, actually found out that card supports everywhere from 4.910 to 6100 megahertz. So that's both 4.9 gigahertz, your standard 802.11a type stuff, and even that 5.9 gigahertz stuff. But Ubiquiti doesn't want to tell you that because I'm sure they'll get a big slap on the wrist from the FCC.
And don't set it over 6 gig. If you set it above that, you will fry the card.
Yeah. They're not very well tested. Be careful with that stuff. So this guy Kugitsumu was like, oh man, this is amazing, and actually wrote a debug patch for the drivers. Because again, the biggest problem here is even though the hardware supported it, the drivers in Linux didn't support it. So he wrote this debug patch, and this was a little while ago, and it's no longer supported in the newest stuff. So his patch was for Mad Wi-Fi. The kind of current 802.11 stack in Linux is Compat Wireless. Go ahead. No, it's not a software-defined radio. All the radio equipment is in the card, so it deals with the modulation.
It's a standard 802.11
yeah.
VG card.
Yeah, you could. I guess that's a good question that a lot of people ask us about this talk. Is why not just use a software-defined radio to do all this stuff? It's kind of free as you want to play with it. The thing is, certain software-defined radios can be really expensive, especially when it gets up into that frequency range. And this is an off-the-shelf card you can pick up all over the place. And we'll show you that you can use it to play around with stuff. So some other people made some other patches to try to get this to work, or at least expand it. They weren't necessarily targeting 4.9. So Zero Chaos actually wrote a patch for it. Again, this is older. It no longer works, and it doesn't support different channel widths. And remember, channel widths was a big thing on 4.9 gigahertz because they can change them. They can be 10 megahertz, 5 megahertz, a couple of different things. This other guy, Spench, who is like an internet rock star to me, he makes, like every time I get interested in anything, I found out Spench did some work on this stuff. So that guy, I owe him a lot of beers. But he actually wrote this crazy patch for this thing to make it work with radar systems. And it was just a crazily intense patch. It did do some of the stuff, but it was way too complex, and it was like overkill for what we needed. And it was old. It was written for an older set of drivers. So we had to start looking at Compat Wireless and saying, all right, well, how can we modify these drivers to work the way we want to, and be able to operate in this 4.9 gigahertz spectrum? So the way Compat Wireless works is it has this main kind of regulatory module here, and it queries the adapter itself, and in the EEPROM is actually hardwired the regulatory domain in which the card should operate. So the Compat Wireless queries it, says, where should you operate? It'll say, I should operate in US. It says, okay, fine. And then it looks up in one of two places. It tries to determine what is the channel lists that are applicable to that regulatory domain. So in Japan, their channel list is going to be drastically different or somewhat different than our channel list in the US. And in some frequencies on Japan would be regulated by the FCC here. So you want to make sure that wherever the card's transmitting, it doesn't break any laws. So it goes to one of two spots. It goes to these built-in driver definitions or this CRDA, this Central Register Domain Agent. It's basically a userland daemon that queries this other little database for all of the information. So what we did was we kind of modified things a little bit in the regulatory module and also in this regulatory database, so it returned back 4.9 gigahertz channels as well. There was this little function here. It's IWRegSet. And the idea behind it is if you were in Japan and you went to the US, you should be able to change your car's regulatory domain so that you don't mess up.
It never works.
Yeah, but it just doesn't work. It's like a null function.
There was a number of patches a few years ago that were were created just to make that actually work, to be able to allow that, make that what do you call it? What's the word I'm looking for here? Yes, something of that nature. Basically, just to be able to honor you setting a setting with it, but that doesn't work anymore either.
All right, so what we had to do is take a look at the drivers, and we did some really intense hacking for this one. Basically, we looked through the drivers and found this lovely function, is 4.9 gigahertz allowed? And said, okay, well, we followed it down a little bit and changed the code just a little bit. And now 4.9 gigahertz is always allowed for kind of all the drivers. It's pretty intense hacking. The other problem was those different channel widths. And so with the channel widths, that was actually a little bit more work. We had to read basically 5 or 6 lines of commented code. And basically somebody said, hey, look, I know somebody's going to want to do this in the future. I'm too lazy to do this now. These are the things that you should do to make it work. So we had to write a couple more lines of code, and all the drivers now support it. So what you do is basically you have to compile these drivers, the specific modules for your system, have one of those Ubiquity cards, and it's really simple. You just do a mod probe to the driver and define the channel width that you want to use. And you can use any channel width that you want to do it. You can't do dynamic channel widths, but you can set them at module load time. So to do the actual install, I created a really quick script. Just go to Open Security Research on GitHub and just run this, and it works. Actually, like 2 nights ago, I wanted to test everything out and just ran the script. I lost all the stuff that I was working on before, and it actually worked. So I can say it actually works. And then to set everything up, you can set your bandwidth mode, just set up a mounted remote interface, define your frequency, and then you can just use TCP dump or Wireshark or even Kismet. So we were talking about that database that defines all of the channels. So on the GitHub, we have these kind of configuration files here. This configuration file will just say, in the US, we support basically 4.910 to 6100. And it'll always support that forever. When you want to use Kismet, you have to define some channel lists. Like Dragorn is the coolest guy if you've ever interacted with him. He's super nice. He's the author of Kismet. And basically the way he wrote Kismet was that he just takes whatever the hardware tells it. So we're telling the hardware to do stuff already. So we just tell Kismet just a little bit about it, and we can define our channel lists however we want and do all that stuff. And we can sniff on it really easily with Kismet.
And this is why it's important. You have to know what the channel centers are that a given implementation is using and the channel widths so that you can define them appropriately.
All right, and then you also have to buy an antenna. That's not too hard to find. You can search online a little bit. You'll find one on all your kind of standard places. Whatever hyperlink is now called, I always forget.
WLANparts.com,
yeah.
$20. It's Pasadena Networks. Sorry, I'm getting too close to the mic here.
It reminds me of that Fight Club episode. Where she at the end, she's like, I really want to have sex. Like, all right, anyway, so we had this adapter. We were super excited. We were jumping up and down. We can sniff 4.9 gigahertz. Everything worked. So we jumped over to New Jersey where all of the fun happens, and we drove around for days, man. It sucked.
Yeah.
We were stuck in traffic. We created traffic. It was amazing.
Hottest day of the year.
Yeah, it was really good. What was messing with us is we kept seeing these freaking antennas all over the place, and we just at one point we got brazen. We would just drive up to an antenna, and like some of them were low hang, so we just drive up and just sit in the front
stood
facing
on the roof
antenna.
of the car with a panel antenna.
And it's like the area is like you get off the parkway and it's like a rest stop. So like there's traffic coming. We're standing on the roof, and there's traffic passing us.
The state police barracks next door.
Yeah, we were pretty brazen because we were just getting so pissed off it. Well, if we did just a little bit more research, we would have discovered that actually, even though Jersey uses 4.9 gigahertz, they primarily use it for WiMAX, which our 802.11 adapters wouldn't have picked up. So we wasted a lot of days for that. But we learned Google and all of those FCC license search and all that stuff is really your friends, and to not ignore that reconnaissance step. So the next thing, since I live in New York City, I jumped on my bicycle, made a list of precinct maps, which I was just driving around on my bike.
War pedaling.
Well, I was war pedaling, but the problem is I'm riding around on my bike, and I have a list, like a Google Maps outline of all of the precincts. And I have this like computer with this antenna out of my backpack. And if any cop would have stopped me, man, they would have just like, I would have been like immediate terrorist, just because it looked so shady to me. But they have this whole crazy mesh network with, again, here's that other picture I was showing. So I was trying to figure out, what's the deal with them? How are they being used? And I came across a lot of this stuff. These constant probe requests that constantly came out over and over again. I masked out the SSIDs to try to be as nice as I could to them. But a lot of them were default, so there were actually a lot of default SSIDs. The messed up thing is I never actually saw data coming over any of this stuff. It was only management frames, which is really interesting to me. I met this other dude, and he said that these things are used on demand. So a cop gets to a scene, sees that there's a camera, sends some sort of like activate, Megatron now, and that thing turns on and starts watching, and he can get a feed off of that. I don't really know how it works, but even like ever since Hurricane Sandy happened in New York, there's been lights, like normally on these things, they're just all dark, right? But as soon as Hurricane Sandy started, there's been these green and red lights flashing on them. So I thought that maybe like they were all activated, but still I couldn't get any data out of it. Nothing was there.
So this is another case where there's default SSIDs in use too, right? And if I remember correctly, this is dual band equipment. So it's another case of where
this isn't dual band.
This wasn't dual band.
No.
All right.
But the stuff we'll talk about.
When we talk about the other thing.
So I was going to station, and again, I just started getting brazen. I would just stop my bicycle across the street from a police department, open up, point the antenna at them, and just like, and sometimes it was like the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. Like, why am I there, you know? And like cops would look at me, like walk by and be like, I don't know, he's not smoking crack, you know? So, I mean, I don't know. I figure they always seem to be heightened over there. They should have really punched me in the face or done something, but they didn't. But randomly, I didn't get too much from the stations, but I did come across this, and I was like, oh, well, this looks good. And then I started to notice that they're actually using Leap for their 802.11 handshake on here. So that's a big problem. I don't know if too many people are familiar with 802.11 security, but basically Leap transmits a challenge and response in plain text over the air.
Uses MS Chat V2 in the clear. So
it's no good. I didn't want to mess around with that because I didn't want to get kicked in the balls, or I don't want to wake up to a morning raid or anything like that. So I kind of removed it. Go. 802.11. No. So 802.11 Enterprise and other versions, they use 802.1x underneath for the different EAP.
You have a number of different EAP types, right? You can have PEEP, LEAP, EAP TLS, EAP TTLS.
On 802.11,
it's common a lot of places, I gotta say. But the unfortunate thing about it, is that Leap passes that handshake in the clear with no sort of TLS tunnel or any kind of protection to try to protect it. And as of DEF CON this year, with Moxie and Hikari's research, now pretty much any MS Chat V2 handshake can be cracked within, 24 hours?
Yeah, so there is the way that cracking these handshakes happens, the way that they've been brute forcing them has been kind of not very optimized. And so Moxie actually gave a talk, and Hikura gave a talk at DEF CON showing a very much more optimized way to crack those passwords, and they said they can crack them in 24 hours. So that's really scary to think that the NYPD is using something that can be cracked in 24 hours on this network. And it just makes me think like, all right, well, maybe they just feel like there's this implied level of security because it's on this 4.9 gigahertz spectrum. I don't know. The other thing that we noticed was those cameras, and they were only transmitting those management frames. We were wondering if that was Proxim's wireless outdoor routing protocol. They have this very proprietary mesh network protocol that operates on a mesh network.
It's like a modified 802.11.
Yeah, like older versions, you can do some hacks with it, but the newer versions, you can't really do too much. So we couldn't play around with too much. At that point, I didn't feel comfortable continuing on because I thought that might be more of a targeted attack against them, and I don't want to start targeting them or even get into the realm where I might be kicking the ball.
That gets into the whole modifying thing that the EFF warned us about. But with the older versions, you can remove the frame check sequence, and because it's a sort of modified 802.11 protocol, if you do that, you're able to read the traffic. Newer versions, and not quite so lucky, but.
So when we were in Vegas, we said, all right, well, no better time than now. So we started to look at to Las Vegas, and we found some kind of interesting things.
What happened was I went up to my room. We were teaching class in Vegas at Black Hat, and I went up to my room, and I just flipped on the wireless. I was just kind of, checking through the 2.4 gigahertz. I had my Alpha card out on my desk, and I see this Moto Mesh SSID. I'm like, Moto Mesh? And I'm like, I know it's Motorola equipment, and I'm like, that likely is a dual band radio. It's probably the Moto Mesh Quattro or variant. So I'm like, whoa. So I immediately called Brad. I'm like, Brad, I think we might have something here. Because he was asking me, he's like, do you think there's any 4.9 in Vegas? I'm like, well, they got a citywide license, I don't know. We were actually going to go drive out to the outskirts where there was defined sites. But anyway, I call him. I'm like, dude, we got to go check this out. So we go grab a laptop.
Yeah, I put on my pants, and we went as fast as we could.
We're walking up and down the Vegas Strip with a laptop.
And then but what we started to see is, like when you see one ant, you start to see like 15,000. So as soon as we started to look around, we're like, holy shit, man. Look at this. All of these poles have all of these antennas on them, and there's all of this crap oh my God, we're in 4.9 gigahertz fucking heaven, man. This is amazing. So we went nuts, started up our sniffer, and we started to find all types of kind of interesting stuff. So the first thing we found was this Moto Mesh network, and as Rob was saying, there's this with the Moto Mesh network. It's kind of interesting. They have two different radios, and so what they do is they'll use one radio, and there's three.
Four.
Oh yeah,
four
right,
on two different bands.
Right.
It operates on the 2.4 and 4.9 gigahertz spectrums, but there's 4 radios. So 2 of them will be 802.11 compliant. One on the 4.9 gigahertz spectrum and one on the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. The other 2 are Motorola Mobility Enhanced Access, the Motorola MEA, which is a proprietary mesh protocol, and there'll be one of each on each spectrum there too. MEA's big thing is that it's mesh optimized, and so basically it's good for, like, for instance, a cop car zooming by a fixed AP at 90 miles an hour. It's optimized for that sort of thing, and also it has a sort of like a GPS capability where basically it can tell where a given unit is, say a police car unit, based on what route the last packets took from it. So things like that. There's other solutions that do that sort of thing, but basically that's one of the more enhanced mesh offerings, I suppose.
Yeah, but the kind of interesting thing about it is because it has those two different, the 4.9 and the 2.4 radios on them. What they do is if one's more crowded than the other, it'll just switch over and use the other one. But now you're giving 2 methods of access. So 4.9 might have been somewhat protected because there's this kind of entry gap to get access to it. But it's also offered on 2.4. So once we started seeing 2.4, we turned on our 4.9 antennas, and sure enough, we were seeing it there as well. So that was really interesting. Problem again with that is very similar to New York in that we only saw very kind of specific frames there, and most of the frames were all management frames. Every once in a while we'd see this other thing, but most of it was all management frames. Our only guess again was that they're on-demand cameras and stuff.
Snap frames, spanning tree, DHCP, stuff like that. So thinking that the majority of the traffic was traversing the MEA network.
Yeah, and then, we started to dig into a little bit, and there was these kind of like odd, there was kind of these other odd frames that were jumping around a little bit on us, so we started to dig into them. Wireshark couldn't really pick out what they were, but if you dig down, it looked like to be some sort of advertisement frame. But again, we really wanted to be careful. We're really worried about legal. We didn't want to dive too much into it. So the Moto Mesh network, like we talked about, has a couple of different things, but the cool identifier for that is if you search for 2.4 gigahertz with a standard adapter, if you see a Moto Mesh ID, it almost always will have a 4.9 gigahertz radio on it. But there's no even reason to look at that. And then, for whatever reason, the gods were shining bright on Rob's room, because we found this one other network that Rob discovered in his room that was only in his room. Like, we couldn't find it anywhere else, and we were like moving up and down. It was ridiculous. We looked like idiots, like Ghostbusters running around. I don't doubt it.
Likely.
But yeah, so we started to dive into this other network. My only guess is that it was some sort of point-to-point link, and we just so happened to be like, we're giving a talk at DEF CON about hacking 4.9 gigahertz, and we're in the room that's 4.9 gigahertz is being fed like right into it. It was weird. So yeah, it was kind of strange. So we found that it turned out to be this Sky Pilot network, and I don't know shit about it. We looked it up. I think there was some point-to-point stuff, but we don't know what the hell it is. And we don't want to transmit on any of this stuff. We were just kind of observing and trying to be as general as we could. So that's kind of everything that we found from Wardriving and looking around and seeing what's available. There are definitely a lot of proprietary protocols, so you're going to have to know your mesh networks and your point-to-point stuff if you want to look at a lot of it. Sometimes, and obviously the channels is the biggest thing. You're going to do a lot of searching trying to find the different channels.
All right, so go ahead, one.
Yeah.
So, in the process of doing research into this, I was wondering, I was like, has there been any attacks against 4.9 gigahertz networks or public safety networks in general? So I don't know if you guys remember. This is a couple months before DEF CON, I guess. There was this article all over the the InfoSec news sites about a hacker that might have targeted Lamont, Illinois, and another town nearby. Tornado sirens. Now, tornado sirens are new to me, being from Jersey. But I was kind of looking at this a little bit, and I was like, well. I do know that that's one of the things that generally is run over 4.9 gigahertz networks. So I started doing a little digging into it. And you can go ahead one. And I saw that there was in one of the articles, it stated that Federal Signal was the vendor that was being used there. That they had them correct the problem for whatever reason, whatever they had that was incorrect. They didn't specify. But anyway, I looked into the PR Newswire a little bit and saw that Federal Signal, who's a known manufacturer of 4.9 gigahertz tornado siren systems, did in fact do their implementation and had a public relations release about it.
It's an interesting coincidence.
Yeah. So what it did look like, by all accounts, is that there was an attack over 4.9 gigahertz network. But nobody would have ever seen that coming.
I don't know where. Yeah, it's strange stuff.
And don't laugh. That was from 2 years ago. But if you Google tornado sirens, right, or Google something like for instance, tornado siren hack or tornado siren how to hack. There's a Google autocomplete will autocomplete it in a number of different ways. So I'm not the only one suggesting for that. Look searching for that. At any rate,
it's awesome. All right, any questions, concerns, guys? LTE. Yeah. Well, it would. Yeah.
Before somebody else buys them.
Yeah, that I have no idea, but it won't be available to us. I mean, it's going to be available to public safety, local law enforcement, those kind of people.
Or is she talking about the Nextel conversion?
No.
Oh, no.
The LTE, yeah.
Oh, she's talking about the old Nextel spectrum that they're going to be using LTE. I don't really know for sure.
The old Nextel spectrum they were going to use for P25.
Well, no, they moved. Okay, so
I guess
they shuffled them around. When Sprint bought Nextel, they got their spectrum, the rebanded spectrum, right? After it's been moved, Nextel was promised some of the spectrum out of the interference range, right? And they were using that for the ESMR stuff, for their click to talk, right? But they did away with all that now, and now they are going to be using that for LTE. Whether they're going to be successful in that endeavor, they were allowed to do it, which was interesting. The FCC allowed them to do it. So I don't know. Somebody got lobbied correctly, I suppose.
Any other questions? All right, cool guys. Oh, in the back. It would be the equivalent of like
802.11a.
You see,
but the closest thing likely would probably be 802.11j, but that's not really standard. It's so much of a frequency and channel range.
It's using OFDM. It's using OFDM, and the thing is, it's not. So 802.11a also defines the frequency spectrum that it operates in.
It uses OFDM just like 802.11a does, but there's no standard for it per se.
Exactly.
Yeah. Out of all of this, the only thing that actually has a standard was the DSR, the 5.9 gigahertz we're talking about. That's 802.11p, which is the IEEE 1609, I think, standard. It's wireless access in vehicular environments, but that's the only one that's actually standards based.
Yeah, no worries. Okay.
So It has an Atheros chipset, and those particular Atheros chipsets are able to be opened up from 4 gigahertz to 6100, or a little over 6 gigahertz. There's a number of Atheros chipsets that are okay. So all right. So the modifications we made were to the ATH5K driver, which is used for that the SRC 300. In theory, now we didn't make this modification, but in theory it shouldn't be too difficult to make the same modifications to the ATH9K driver, which is used with the Ubiquiti SR71C card. It shouldn't be too much difference there at all, I would suppose.
I think there's something very specific in that model number of the Atheros chipset. So I know like the Netgear WAG511 has the same, it uses the same ATH5K drivers, but I don't think that chipset's, the radio is a little different. So I think you would have to, I don't know, but you'd have to research that specific one. Yeah.
There probably is other ones that could be used, but
yeah, I tried it on 2. Well, any other questions? All right, cool guys, thanks.
Cool, thank you. All right. Welcome through. Let's get your thing here.
Oh yeah.
Guys, we've had a scheduling conflict, so we're going to have to be out of here for a full hour at least, and everybody needs to go ahead and clear out if that's okay. So.
All I want is more beer. It probably wouldn't be too difficult.
The thing is, this whole like realm is so touchy that